Greetings. Welcome. I'm your host. My name is Mike Bankhead. I'm a bass player and songwriter from Dayton, Ohio. Hey, guess what? I have a very special guest for you on this episode. It is a tastefully named gentleman from Brooklyn. And not only is he tastefully named, but he is also today the special guest for episode 50. That's right, episode 50 of the You Could Be My Aramis podcast. I really enjoy listening to this gentleman talk on his podcast, and it's a pleasure having a conversation with him. I think you'll enjoy this one too, dear listener. Let's get to it. I should start by saying that you are, of course, tastefully named.
Yeah, I appreciate whenever anyone says that. I do like my name very much.
How about introducing yourself to the folks that might be listening?
Cool. Well, my name is Mike Joseph. I am the host and producer of a podcast called Detoxicity, which Mr. Bankhead has been on. It is largely about masculinity and mental health and personal progression. So that's one of the things that I do. I've worked in the music industry for 29 years. I am a journalist. I am a mental health advocate. I am a positive sexuality advocate. I do a lot of speaking about these things at places, colleges, panel discussions, that kind of stuff. I'm a DJ. I host a radio show. So I do a lot of things.
There's a lot to unpack there.
There is a lot to unpack.
I want to start with the name of your podcast, specifically Detoxicity. Mm-hmm. This is not an anti-System of a Down podcast.
It is not. Toxicity is a very good album.
It is. What's the toxic thing that we are trying to undo here?
Masculinity as a general trope. I think obviously masculinity has multiple definitions, but the definition that has sort of been brought into culture by many of our forebearers, in which there are even there being clearly defined gender roles, but sort of the classic definition of men as having to always be strong and unfeeling and non-emotional, and the idea that having emotions and taking care of yourself mentally and being there for other people is somehow not masculine, and just doing away with that trope. And I try to do that by talking to people and speaking to their journeys, as opposed to just talking about myself and my own journey, because I think everybody has a story. And I think people are inherently interesting. And I think when people allow themselves to open up, there's a lot that can be taught to others.
We agree that people can be very interesting if you let them talk. And on the topic of the way masculinity is presented in our culture, it's not just our culture. Our neighbors in Latino America, there's some very specific behaviors around machismo, right? I mean, the word machismo ingrained in their culture, which affects the way that people grow up and treat their fellow human beings.
Yeah. You see it. It's not just American culture. It is Latin culture. It is African culture. It is, just speaking to what I know and people I know, a lot of Asian culture is very patriarchal. Culture, world culture in general is largely patriarchal. And these outmoded ideas of what a patriarchal structure should be need to go away, because I think those are going to contribute to ultimately the downfall of society. It leads a lot to where we are culturally, societally right now, and things need to change.
And you mentioned that you've done a lot of work in mental health, and that ties right in with the idea of masculinity being toxic. And you even mentioned it. You said that it's looked upon askance if we as men show feelings or cry or talk about mental struggles. which is kind of too bad because how do you fix it if you won't talk about it, right?
Exactly. I think that's the biggest problem. I mean, there are a lot of problems when it comes to accessing mental health, and one is actual access, but a bigger problem, I think, is acknowledgement, where people, how can you get help for an issue if you don't recognize or won't acknowledge that you have an issue that needs to be dealt with?
Are you comfortable talking about your journey dealing with your mental health? I mean, I know I
it.
see you do it a lot on Twitter,
Yeah.
but that can't be fun because I don't like talking about it.
It's not fun, but I think it's keeping it in isn't a good thing. And maybe I have a savior complex or something. I don't know. I think putting it out there, well, some of it is self-serving. Putting it out there, I think helps people understand me better. But also, I think it empowers people to speak their truth. And that, I think, ultimately is why I'm so vocal and so open, because if I can prevent someone else from dealing with the that I've dealt with over the course of my life, then it's worth it. Then exposing myself the way I do is worth it.
With that in mind, how are you today?
I'm sick. So I'm a little lightheaded, feeling a little weak, I guess. Mentally, I have COVID-19. I have been in extreme isolation for the past 5 days, so I'm a little stir crazy. I've barely been out of not just my apartment. I've barely been out of my room, and just this between COVID and the fact that I had to put off some very, very important personal stuff on account of being infected with COVID and the state of the world in general. I've been better, Mike. I have been better, but I'm trying to just keep my head up and keep moving as best as possible.
I like how you didn't just say fine.
That's horrible. If someone asks me how I'm doing and I say fine, it's because either it's way too complicated for me to explain it to you, or B, it's way too complicated for me to explain it to you, and I don't think you're worth the explanation.
I have, in the last several years, as I've gotten more aware of trying to deal with my own mental health issues, stop saying fine to that question.
Because it ain't true most of the time.
It's not. And in our culture, we are expected to ask it and receive fine, and it's all perfunctory.
Right.
How are you is not a greeting. That's after the greeting.
Right. How are you is a question.
I feel like people in our culture specifically don't do this right. And I mean, from my travels, you go to other countries and how are you is not hello. Like you don't ask that unless you really want to know how someone's doing, But here it's just another form of hello. And are you asking or are you just being perfunctory? So when I am not, if the answer is not good or whatever it is, I go ahead and say that. And then often people don't really want you to elaborate.
No, they don't.
I think that's one way to know who your real friends are.
I agree with you. Yeah. It's funny. There's a difference, and it's such like a tiny, tiny little thing, right? There's a difference between hi, period, how are you, question mark, and hi, comma, how are you, question mark. It's just a period and a comma, but it turns out to be two completely different statements.
So, dear listener, what we're trying to say is just think a little bit more about your interactions with other people.
Yeah. Don't ask somebody how they are unless you really want to know.
Unless you really want to know. All right. So, mental health advocate.
Yes.
Podcast host.
Yes.
Specifically talking about bad masculine traits.
Which are not exclusive to men, by the way.
Oh, of course not.
I definitely want to clear that up. And the tagline of the podcast is by men, about men, for everyone. And toxic traits that are seen as masculine affect everyone, and they're not just practiced by men either.
I feel like a decent tagline might be just don't be a jerk.
Yeah, well, that's a good tagline for life. I would print that on a T-shirt and just give one to every single person in the world. Don't be that should be the baseline for living. Don't be a jerk.
Yeah, even when you're in a bad mood and you want to be.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Which is a thing.
Yeah, there are plenty of times when I want to be in, and I like to think that I suppress those impulses significantly more often than not.
You are also a recovering music industry employee type person.
Well, I'm not recovering.
You're still a music industry.
Yeah, okay, I'm still in the trenches, my man.
Well, as a musician, this is something I would like you to talk about because on your podcast, I haven't listened to every episode. I got to be honest, but I don't really hear you talk about your work in the music business, even though you do interview musicians.
Yes, I don't. There's a part of me that likes keeping those separate. I like the idea of plausible deniability. But also, look, I mean, part of my mental health journey is having spent the last 29 years working in the music industry. So they're tied together, whether I like it or not.
Am I allowed to ask what exactly you do?
I work for yes, I work for a distribution company. I am a client manager, which sounds like it could be just a regular office job, and in a lot of ways it is. But any regular office job put into the circus that is the music industry then becomes an irregular office job.
Yeah, I'll bet.
So, but I'm currently a client manager, but I've worked as a sales rep. I have worked in PR. I have done marketing, like email marketing. I have worked in a record store. I've managed a record store. I have been a buyer. I have done many, many different things over the years.
So as a distributor, are your end clients the musicians or are your end clients the record companies?
My clients are actually labels.
Okay. So yeah. That was the second thing.
Yeah.
That makes sense. See, now I have a clearer picture of what you're doing. People who are not into the music industry or probably still don't get it.
Well, it's when I try to explain it to lay people, sometimes it feels a little bit more complicated than it is. Basically, distribution. The music has to get to you in a particular way. And it's not like, say, Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift doesn't just knock on Spotify's door and goes, "Hey, Mr. or Mrs. Spotify, here is my music. Please put it on your service."
Although if anyone could, she could.
Right. Yes. It usually has to go through distribution pipes. And, back in the day, those distribution pipes were handled by 6 major labels, and then 6 became 5, 5 became 4, 4 became 3. And there are also now a ton of independent distribution companies that have contractual structures that are more favorable than the majors in a lot of cases, offer a bit of more artistic and creative freedom in some cases. Well, and if you're a label, you have to be distributed by a distributor. So I am basically the middle person between the label and the distributor. The distributor, if you're Taylor Swift, the distributor gets you music into record stores and onto DSPs. The label usually handles marketing and, like your social media plan and all that other stuff. And I'm the guy that sits in the middle. I communicate between both sides.
And in that answer, you already answered the next point I was going to bring up. I was going to say it's not just digital. All you folks out there that like to buy vinyl,
and people still buy CDs. Let's not.
Yeah, I do, but I feel like not enough people do. I love CDs, and I'm always going to love CDs. Yeah. But if you buy hard copy music, there's a reason that you can go to if you still have record stores in your community, there's a reason you can go to your record store and find music from across the country and across the world. and that's distributors. Like,
Right.
if unless you live in Dayton, you're not going to find my music in your record store because I don't have a distributor. If I want my music to be in a record store, I have to physically go to the record store and talk to someone there.
Right. So they can put your stuff on consignment.
Yep, exactly. That's when you're an independent musician, that is how it works.
Oh, yeah.
When you have a little bit more oomph behind you, meaning money from another company to get you distribution, then you can have your music in more places available to more people.
Absolutely.
So, do you think that most people in your part of the business love music, or is it a job? I'm not talking about you. I know you love music, but what about the other folks on your side of the business?
I think the majority of the people that I work with either love music or loved music before the business part of it got to them.
That makes sense. The business part's not remotely fun.
No, but I do think I'm just mentally scanning all of my coworkers, and I do think that the majority of them, I mean, a lot of them are musicians. So I do think the majority of them love music and are super passionate about it. Otherwise, they'd go work for an investment banking firm or something, or a startup or whatever.
Do you have a favorite record that you heard this year so far, as far as new stuff?
My favorite record that I've heard this year is Kendrick Lamar's latest record. Everything that Kendrick Lamar touches, I am fanatical about. I haven't heard, I gotta say, Mike, I have not heard a ton of great music this year, and we're closing in at the end of July. So there's only 5 months left in the year. So I think my best of 2022 list, unless some crazy stuff happens in the next few months, my best of 2022 list is going to be fairly short.
I have not listened to the Kendrick Lamar album, but in my defense, I generally steer clear of super major label stuff.
Sure.
I will get to it because I read a lot on Twitter about how people loved it. I'm going to recommend that you listen to specifically 2 podcasts I did this year. I have a music journalist on every quarter, and we talk about our favorite records of the quarter.
Uh-huh.
So you might find something you like in those conversations. I'll drop you an email after we have this talk and send you that way. Since you're still quarantining and there isn't anything else to do.
Seriously.
Some new music discovery might be useful.
Yeah, I'm only halfway through my sentence.
I like the way you express that. And it's not like you're guilty.
Seriously. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it is almost as if the state of New York has said, go to your room.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not good in situations where my freedom is compromised. I've spent time in psychiatric hospitals, and the worst thing about all of them is that you can't leave until they tell you to leave. And in this case, I could be and go out, and I've walked out of my apartment to throw the garbage away, but I'm trying to be safe and be conscientious towards other people and stay in my room. I've even, up until today, I've kept my pet in another room because I've heard that pets can actually get COVID-19 from their owners.
That is true.
So, yeah. So until today, I was even doing that. But it does feel like, I mean, I'm kind of a homebody. I like being in my apartment, but being not just in my apartment, but in my room and not being able to go anywhere else really, really blows.
Yeah, I'll bet. Anecdotally about pets, there's not too many places here in Dayton that really will stand up and encourage people to wear their masks indoors, even though with the latest variant, we really should still wear our masks indoors.
Yeah.
But there is a cat cafe where they have a bunch of rescue cats, and you are absolutely not permitted to go in the room where the cats are without your mask on.
As it should be.
And I don't feel like anyone ever argues with them on that.
I would imagine that most people who are pet lovers are not jerks.
One could only hope.
Yes.
So you live in Brooklyn.
I live in Brooklyn. I was born in Brooklyn.
Just like the Beastie Boys.
Were all 3 Beastie Boys born in Brooklyn? You're probably right about that.
I have no idea. I just know they had that song about Brooklyn.
Yeah, no sleep till Brooklyn. Indeed.
What's it like growing up in a city that big? I mean, I'm a Midwest kid, so
So it's funny. I don't think I realized the scope of growing up in New York City or even Brooklyn. I didn't realize how big Brooklyn was until I was a teenager because I was back in those days before I was old enough to like take public transportation by myself and all that other stuff. My neighborhood was my neighborhood. My neighborhood was really just, kind of a couple block radius, and it felt very small. And it wasn't until I was older and able to travel around a bit that I really got a scope of how big Brooklyn is, how big New York City is, and then how big those two entities are compared to most of the rest of this country. So it took a while for me to really understand the scale of it. And my elementary school was 2 blocks away from where I lived. My junior high school was a 15 to 20-minute walk from where I lived. So my world until I was in high school was very concentrated in like a 2-3 mile radius. So it didn't feel big at all. It was actually very, I don't want to say segregated necessarily in a bad way, but it was a lot less cosmopolitan and diverse than one would think.
wow. When I think of Brooklyn, I think it's pretty diverse. Like you said, totally different neighborhood from the really moneyed people that live down by the river, and then you've got like the Russian part of the neighborhood, and then
Yeah, I mean,
you got a lot of black people. I mean, it seems diverse to me, but I don't live there.
It's different now. Brooklyn is a lot more mixed up than it was in the 80s and 90s. But when I was growing up, I mean, the neighborhood that I lived in was pretty much all families from the Caribbean. The people that lived next door to me were American. There was a really old white lady that stayed after white flight, the only white person on my whole block. But everybody was, 85%, 80% of the people were black and from the Caribbean. All of the Asian people, a lot of the Latin people that you saw were service workers or they owned shops or whatever. So it just kind of the neighbor and a lot of Brooklyn was like that. You had Bensonhurst, which was mostly Italians. You had Brighton Beach, which was mostly Russians. You had, Williamsburg and Bushwick, which were mostly Hispanic. And I think post Giuliani, post early 2000s, once Bloomberg hit, I think that's when you started to see gentrification in a lot of these neighborhoods. And now, like the neighborhood I live in, I love it because it is completely mixed up and not in a way that really seems, not in a way that seems like, oh, here come the gentrifiers taking over the neighborhood, but there are still a lot of families from the Caribbean that own houses in my neighborhood. There are mansions like a block and a half away, which have very well-to-do people. You walk a couple of blocks in one direction and you're like right in the hood. You walk a couple of blocks away in the other direction and there is a neighborhood that is actually very heavily Indian, and everybody kind of coexists in this little area, which didn't exist to this extent 30 years ago. Or 35 years ago or 40 years ago.
That's a cool life experience to be around that kind of diversity. And I'm sure you're aware that in much of the United States, basically outside of your very large cities, it's pretty homogenous.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I lived in Boston for 8 years, and
well, Boston is that's one pale city.
Yeah, Boston is like white with the capital H. It's white. And I had never experienced that before. Like when I was like, even when I went to like my neighborhood growing up was pretty much all black. And when I got to high school, it was really, other than the couple of years that I lived in Michigan as a kid, it was the first time that I was in a space where I was regularly interacting with non-black people. And the white people that I was interacting with were all ethnic. They were all Jewish, or they were Italian, or they identified as those things before they identified as white people. So kind of the generic waspy white people, I was not really aware of in any way, or did interact with on a regular basis in any way until I moved to Boston. And, at that point I was 29. So it's kind of a weird thing. And Boston, there are certainly ethnic white people, but most of them are waspy, like Irish, descendants of Irish, like that kind of thing. I didn't see any blonde haired, blue eyed white people in New York at all, except for my one friend Anders, who was from Sweden. It was it's a different kind of white.
Where's your Brooklyn accent?
Mm-hmm. I wonder that sometimes. Make me angry and it comes out.
Okay. I asked because I have an uncle that lives in Brooklyn, and he moved there in the 70s. He's from here,
mm-hmm.
but he's been there so long. He sounds like a New Yorker now. And I don't think it's on purpose. I just think he's been there that long. That's just kind of how he talks now. And it's just, I get a kick out of listening to him talk. I'm like, you grew up in Ohio.
You assimilate, man. I think for me, it's, it's a code switching thing kind of, but also
got you.
But also it's like, I grew up in Brooklyn. My folks are from the Caribbean, so they never really had much of a New York accent. I spent a few years in the Midwest. My mom has lived in Michigan for the past 40 something years. She has a very flat Midwestern accent. And I've picked up on the vernacular of various other minority groups that I belong to. So the Brooklyn accent, it's there, but I think if you pop me into a room full of New Yorkers, or you piss me off, it's going to come out more strongly than it would in just regular conversation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Where in the Caribbean are your folks from?
Yeah, my mom is from Aruba, which many people know thanks to the Beach Boys' Kokomo. And my dad is from Guyana.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do they make curried goat in either of those two countries?
They make curried goat in Guyana, for sure.
That's the first thing I thought of when you said that there were a lot of Caribbean people in your neighborhood. I'm like, man, I bet the curried goat's pretty good there.
Curried goat is more so, I think, a Trinidadian and Jamaican thing. But I definitely grew up with literally like our back, the average person has backyard barbecues for like the 4th of July or during the summer, and they're making like hot dogs and hamburgers and stuff like that. My folks definitely made curried goat.
That is nothing to be ashamed of.
No. And I mean, it's funny. Like one story I tell is that, my grandparents moved to this country in 1971. So 5 years before I was born. And I remember when I was really little, we grew up in a house, a 2-family house. And I remember being in the basement, and I don't know, I was maybe like about to take a shower or something like that. And I'd go into the basement, and there's live chickens downstairs in the basement. And we had chicken for dinner that night. And it was fresh ass chicken. It wasn't store-bought chicken. Like my grandmother somehow went somewhere, bought some live ass chickens, and strangled them and plucked them and threw them in the oven. So it's just, culturally it's very different. And I think my upbringing was unique because of that.
Oh, I just blanked on what I was going to ask you next.
Happens to me all the time.
I'm like you. I don't actually. I have a couple of things I want to talk about, but I don't write a whole list of questions out because
I never do that.
It makes the conversation not flow as well, and it makes it kind of stilted. And
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and if I say something dumb, that could be a funny moment.
Also agree.
How much of the country and or the world have you gotten a chance to get out and see outside of Brooklyn? Now, a lot of it comes to you being a New Yorker, but how much of it have you gotten a chance to go see?
I've not gotten to see a lot of the world. I have not actually been outside of North America since I was probably 7 or 8. which sucks. I need to rectify that. And the events of 2020 put a crimp in those plans.
Yeah.
I've seen a fair amount of the country. I think I did one of those, like, how many states have you been to? And I think it was almost exactly half.
That's doing work because, it's not exactly a small country we live in.
Yeah. I mean, you think of like the New York, the tri-state area, New England. I mean, that's probably like 10 states in and of itself. So, I've got that whole like top right corner of the US map covered. I've got most of the bottom right of the US map covered. And then quite a few spaces in between. I think I'm at like 25 or 26 states.
You been to Ohio?
I have been to Ohio multiple times.
What part, if you don't mind?
I have been to Cleveland a few times. When I was a kid, my stepdad rather, used to drive from Detroit to Toledo to get lottery tickets. So, needless to say, I spent a lot of time in Toledo, Ohio. And I want to say those are the only two cities in Ohio I've been to, Cleveland and Toledo.
That's too bad. We have a lot more than that, but
I'm sure there is.
Did you go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, or was that not a thing when you went to Cleveland?
I did go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it's funny. It kind of sucks because my friend Matt Wardlaw, who is an awesome guy, lives in Cleveland, and he is a music journalist who is married to another music journalist, Annie Zaleski. You
actually know Annie Zaleski?
I know Annie Zaleski. Annie Zaleski has stayed at my apartment, has slept in my apartment.
She's really cool. I mean, I just know her from Twitter, but
yeah, Annie is super cool. But Matt has been to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame like 11,000 times. So when I came up and I was like, let's go to the Hall of Fame, he was just like, I was just here. So we kind of like went through it at warp speed. Whereas I would have liked to have spent literally the entire day there.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So next time I go, maybe I'll just have Matt like drop me off and, spend the day kind of wandering around and then have him pick me up.
I mean, I like museums, but man, this is a museum about music.
Yeah. And even I went to the Grammy Museum maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. And even the Grammy Museum, which is certainly not on the scale of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, is a pretty awesome place.
I've not been there. I'm going to assume that's in LA.
Yeah, it's in LA.
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time in LA.
Yeah, I actually several years ago I won a trip to LA, and me and my buddy were like, "Well, we need to find stuff to do to fill up the time," and we ended up going to the Grammy Museum.
That's the best way to go to LA if someone else is paying for it. It's
hell yeah.
Airfare is not exactly cheap right now.
It is not.
What did your childhood smell like?
Oh boy,
that's a question I stole from another podcaster here in Dayton, whose podcast has since gone defunct.
That's an awesome question.
It is. He stole it from someone else, so like he's like, you can't credit me, but like, yeah, I stole it from you. So yeah, that's a Terry Martin question.
Wow, what did my childhood smell like? The overarching smell of my childhood is food.
Be more specific.
Oh, Mike. Ooh.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, you're not Korean, but if you were a Korean, that food is going to smell different than if you were from Pakistan.
That is true.
Then if you were like, regular white folks who you might not even be able to smell the food they're cooking.
That's true. Two things. One, I think, is just kind of overarching breakfast. Like there was either bacon frying or there were like pancakes being made, or one thing that people from the Caribbean, and I don't know if it's Aruba specifically, is Johnny cakes, it's basically like fried dough. And my grandmother would make those every Sunday without fail. I think for the entire 40 years she lived in New York City, there were Johnny cakes every Sunday. And, other members of my family still, have taken up that mantle in the time since. But, and there was always, because I grew up Catholic, there was always fish on Fridays. So those are the smells that I remember.
It's weird how smells take you back in a way that other stuff doesn't, right?
Yeah, there are certain smells, certain things I can smell and literally like transport in my mind back to my grandmother's kitchen, and I can see it in my head. Like I can see it in my head now.
That's pretty awesome. Where can I send the people to find you and listen to you and learn more about Mike Joseph?
Detoxicity is available on every podcast platform, your Spotify, your Apple. You can also follow me on social media. I'm Detox Pod Guy on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok for that matter, although I don't use TikTok that much.
Excellent. Well, thanks for your time. And I just want to say I'm sorry that you stumbled into this terrible virus that is around here.
Yeah, man.
I have managed to avoid it so far, and I wish to continue avoiding it. But
I'm knocking wood for you, Mike.
You never know, right?
I had a good 2.5-year run.
That's more than a lot of people. So,
yeah.
But you sound like you're on the road to recovery. So
fingers crossed.
That's cool. Thank you very much again for being here. And hey, folks, go find the Detoxicity podcast and listen to Mike do his thing.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, man. Take care.
Once again, thank you very much to Mike Joseph for being my special guest for episode 50. Thank you, dear listener, for being here. Even if you are new here, thank you. If you've been here for all the other episodes, thank you double. Hey, I took so long to edit this episode that there's going to be another one coming your way tomorrow. I won't tell you who it is. You'll just have to come back tomorrow and see. Have a lovely rest of the day.